Hey, this is Joe Big House Kenn, and you are inside the house. Powered by Dynamic Fitness and Strength, building a better athlete. In this episode, we're in part 2 with OLine Mastermind, Duke Manyweather. In this episode, we talk about O-line play and dig deep into the offensive lineman's stance. Now, on to the show. Okay, let's jump into a little bit of specifics on O-line play and you being the expert and coming from some of my perspective in history. And if I am incorrect in my history, please correct me. But I think a lot changed for offensive line play when defenses, especially up front, went from 2 gap responsibilities to 1 gap responsibility. And
Yeah,
I'm under the understanding when I kind of listen to coaches that really became a difference maker when Jimmy Johnson took over at the University of Miami and started bringing athleticism up a level. A big safety was now a linebacker. A
yeah,
big linebacker was now a D end. They
yeah,
tried to get more talent, and then it was, hey, we need to displace the O-line and move the line of scrimmage to their deficit. And all of a sudden it went from when I played defensive line before I went to offensive line, and I was coached to not take a step because I was a 2-gap player where you came out and engaged in a 6-point like explosion drill and then read and react from there.
yeah,
If we took a step, we were graded down to that penetration and 1 gap, like the O-line. If there was kind of anything, hey, if you're in a 3 technique, then you had to B gap because the linebacker had the A gap. There was no more 2 gapping. And with that, what I saw was stance changes. So when I
yeah,
played O-line in the late 80s, and it was still primarily a 2 gap type of defensive schemes, we literally looked like we were in track stances. I mean, our heels were off the ground. We remember, this was back when that was your key. Remember, look at a
yeah,
whole lineman's fingertips. If they're red and
yeah,
bloody, they're coming at you. If they're white,
yeah.
then he's sitting
They're
back,
pass
holding
protecting.
their pass protecting. And what I've noticed now is there's more of a flat-footed stance because you have to be more balanced because you're not necessarily aware of where that D line's going to be when the ball is snapped. So when I'm talking about that, tell us a little bit about the differences in those stances and how you saw it evolve as it comes to now the evolution of what I said, athleticism increasing in O-line play. And I'm not saying that O-linemen don't have to be strong, but that pure absolute strength is not, to me, a major factor as it was in generations prior when it was mono a mono, let's play smash mouth. I mean, there's so much more going on at the snap of the ball for O-line. So am I any point correct in that? And then give us your take.
Yeah, yes. So you've touched on a lot of good points, and I'm gonna I'm gonna answer those, and then I'm gonna piggyback because we're starting to see another shift here. Um, so yes, I can remember even coming out, toes were straight ahead. We wanted heels up, a little weight forward because we wanted to get off the ball. We wanted to move the point, and then it was probably really in my senior year in high school, which would have been 2001 or two or something like that, we started to see a shift where we wanted more even weight distribution. We wanted 1 foot more at an angle. We wanted that weight distribution or that tension in the hamstrings to be pretty consistent. We wanted to be locked in and engaged because there was a couple of things that we needed to do. We needed to be able to pass protect. We needed to be able to change directions. We needed to be able to reach. We needed to be able to cut off. We needed to be able to get on the same level as our offensive tackle and quote unquote retreat if we need to pass off some of the line games or the funky blitzes that they started to bring with some of those bigger, faster guys that were now playing linebacker, so 100%. And as you start to look at the evolution of O-line, even in the NFL, we went from when I came up, we had like those golden era offensive linemen with your Jonathan Ogdens and your Willie Ropes and your Orlando Paces, and those guys that were 6'4" to 6'8", and they were 330 and above. Your Larry Allens, just tremendous athletes, brute and absolute strength. We saw a shift in the mid to early 2000s, and it's really in response to what you were talking about how each position got bigger and faster because they were starting to move guys down just a touch. And what you start to see is some of those more athletic type offensive linemen. Your tackles started to be bigger tight ends per se. And some of those interior guys were maybe defensive linemen that were twitched up and explosive, and guys want to kind of convert those guys. But what we're starting to see is kind of a return to that big body, brute strength. Even like Lane Johnson and Teron Armstead, those were two of the best athletes coming out. They were, Teron 6'5" and 308 and still holds the fastest combine time at like a 4.65, 4.7 official. But now he's walking around at 320, and absolute strength is tremendously important. Lane Johnson, same thing. He was a 310, 315 guy. Lane Johnson's been playing at 325 and wants to play at 330 because they understand the importance of, they realize, hey, if I stay healthy and this, like when Sperm met the Ed, they were the athletes that they were, Even when they come to me and train, I'm not going to make those guys any more explosive or anything. My job is to keep them stable, mobile, functional, healthy, and then coach them up on their skills. So, but what they're saying is that if they can add strength to specific areas, that it's going to make them even more effective as an offensive lineman. And I think that's really what my whole philosophy is like, yes, I can 100% get guys strong as hell. And, it takes time to really turn that strength into functional power. If a guy doesn't have it, that takes time. But really identifying the key areas in which some offensive linemen are weak in, certain angles, certain positions, if we can make that stronger, and to me, a lot of it starts from the ground up, but then it starts not only from the ground up with that stance and that base and that foundation, but just that root, being able to strain. I think a lot of the strain and, being able to change directions and to recover comes from that core stability, being able to rotate and anti-rotate, being able to engage the lats and that relationship between elbows and hips and things of that nature. So really the focus is really turned into getting these guys stronger in the areas in which they're weak. And that goes to back to identifying, evaluation, and things of that nature, coming up with a plan that's specific for each of the guys that I'm going to work with. But again, what we're starting to see now, some of these big SOBs being drafted again. Mekhi Becton, guy I worked with this year that's been with me since December, 6'8", 365, 5 flat, he can run. And so you're starting to see some of these guys that have that golden era of size, like the old school guys, but some of this new school, new age athleticism. So when you factor that stuff in, it's pretty freaky and pretty scary what some of these guys are able to do. And it starts to level back out because now you got some of these edge rushers that are 6'4", 6'5", 245, 250. And if they don't get a clean break and some of these big SOBs get their hands on them, it's a wrap, So it's an interesting dynamic. We saw that shift, and then now we're starting to see the pendulum swing back, I think, a little bit with like your Orlando Browns and your Trent Browns and, your Mekhi Bectons and, even your Zach Martins, who's a 6'5", 220 guy, about as strong as they come. Brandon Brooks, 6'5", 355, rocked up, but just absolute monsters and absolute strength is what these guys have. And I think teams are starting to look for that again.
Coach, okay, I want to bring this up because you're bringing up some very unique guys, and I saw these guys come through the combine. But one of the things I've noticed when we're talking about some of these younger kids, especially being the first, I was fortunate to work the flexibility station. So I saw these guys like dead to right, me like standing right next to these guys for their good first hour and a half they're on the field. One of the things I noticed, couple of things. One, with the change of O-line play at the college level, where They've gone to this spread, spending way, almost the entire game in an upright 2-point stance. And I've seen where, yes, I've still seen these freaky guys that you're discussing, but I've also seen a lot of guys who are underdeveloped. Like for my last 2 years in the NFL, I felt like we needed to redshirt a lot of O-linemen. Like it was almost where if I would have stayed in the NFL, the more O-linemen we could get in, that would have been like coaching college again. Because a lot of these guys, and I'm not saying that in no disrespect to where they came from. I'm just saying it just seemed that there was a growing, what's the best word? I just saw too many guys that they were worried about keeping them in shape and running, and their the overall strength development was not as it was when I first started in the NFL. It
was lacking.
Did you see that when you started working with some of these guys more for combine prep?
Yeah, absolutely. What we start to see is that the deficit for each guy, a lot of these guys were limited by only what they were exposed to and knew. So if you asked them to do anything within their program, they could do it. If they had 5 blocks that they could make, that they were asked to make and coached to make within their scheme, no problem doing that. But if you say, all right, well, on Sundays you're going to be asked to do this, huge learning curve. And the movement patterns and just even the overall positioning and the leverages and the angles weren't there. And to your point, with a lot of these 2-point stance, the 2-point stance, a lot of them aren't functional, where there will be a huge discrepancy in between how a 2-point stance and a 3-point stance looked. And what you start to see, especially in that flexibility, is a tremendous amount of imbalances and deficiencies, shortening specifically on one side or another. So one thing, I don't give a damn who I'm working with. I'm going to make sure guys have a functional 2-point and 3-point stance that they can do any and everything out of both of those. And I want them to closely mirror each other in terms of how the 2-point stance and 3-point stance look. I'm a firm believer that the most effective and efficient players are the guys in which from the ground to the waist, that 2-point and 3-point looks the same in terms of tension with the hamstrings and just the activation of loading the big toe instep heel, having that knee in line or slightly tucked in tracking. Because again, we want to be able to use our training. And what I've seen is, what's the point of doing, all these front squats, doing all these lunges, all these cleans, clean and jerks, step ups, and time under tension if we can't apply and functionally use that training. So a lot of the cues in which that I try to give are going to be similar to what we do on the weight room and what we do on the field. Like if I'm cueing a specific thing on a lunge in terms of that guy's up foot and where that weight distribution should be and what he should be feeling, I'm going to revert back and say, all right, let's think about this in essence of pass pro. Where do you want to drive from? And a lot of it is the same time, and it clicks for them. They go, oh, yeah, I feel that. Now I'm much stronger, much more efficient. So, yeah, absolutely. To your point, we start to see a lot of that where guys just weren't asked to do things. And I think it reverts back to, or goes back to, some things that we've talked about at a lot of your clinics, is that once free play went out, some of the foundation and fundamentals of that we grew up doing went out the window. And a lot of those foundation and fundamentals of just like general athleticism and GPP were, once they were ingrained in a free play, like they stuck with us the entire time. And a lot of these kids now hadn't got that.
Yeah, one of the other things I wanted to ask you, if I have any validation with this too, is, and you said a lot of the things that they're asked to do, they're very good at. And this goes back to from a mobility standpoint, because if once you lose the ability to bend, especially as an O-lineman, you're out. Some of these guys aren't even getting in those positions. So I always kind of laughed as a line guy when they would talk about, oh, well, this kid's never played under center when they're talking about quarterbacking. And I'd be like, yeah, and those O-linemen have never been in a 3-point stance. They got the same, they have to relearn how to get down. And like you're saying, some of those guys that play in college are so upright in a 2-point stance, and you're talking about like the flexion needed at the hip and knee to get into a quality 3-point stance in the NFL. You got to be able to be loaded and rigid to bring it, and you're not going to play an entire game in the NFL in a 2-point stance, nor as a quarterback are you going to play an entire NFL game really
Under.
out of, you're going to have to go under center. So when you get these guys in and you're studying, I know how you do your background. Do you see a discrepancy when an O-lineman comes into you as a combine prep guy who spent 90% of his time or even more in a 2-point versus a guy? Because again, so like you said, some of the smaller school guys are still coming in 3-point stances. And I always noticed that the best technical lifters I coached at the NFL came from Division II or III because they had to be good at it. They couldn't just muscle it. So I want to know how and I know you break it down, but how much extra credit time does some of those kids need to work when you're talking about having the same displacement in a 2-point stance versus a 3-point stance?
A lot, and it's not just telling them, it's showing them and then giving them tools to continue to work on it. So the one thing that we try to do from the ground up is start to work on the feet, start to work on the ankles, and then as we know, dysfunction runs up chains. So let's start to eliminate some of that and take away some of those limiting factors. So feet, ankles, even a lot of the big toe activation, and then that gets into the knee and the hip. That way they're able to not only get into a stance, but be able to replicate it, you know? And so what I tell these guys, if I'm going to give you this homework that you're going to work on your feet and ankles every darn night, and then we're going to work on your stance every day. I think stance is the most important skill for offensive linemen because you can't, if you don't have a functional stance, you can't do anything. You're not going to be able to take a set. You're not going to be able to get into a run fit. You're not going to be able to cut off the backside. And so you've got to have a stance that is functional. So we harp on it. One thing when we do a lot of the high school camps and things of that nature, I'll say, hey, spend 10 to 15 minutes a day. Record yourself. We're always on our phones. Record yourself. Go if you want to be honest, you know, get on FaceTime with a buddy or something and, hey, we're going to do stance check for 10 minutes. And I've had guys do that before. Get in front of a mirror. Because what I also saw is that if a guy isn't used to getting into a 2-point or a 3-point consistently, each and every time you ask him to do it, it will start to look different. And they don't even realize it starts to look different. And I say, okay, so your stance changed there. Did you know? I didn't even realize it. And so then we unpack it. We say, okay, if your stance is different every other play, then how do you know how to take a set? How do you know where you're going to end up in that set? How do you know where your inline angle and your landmark is going to be in the run game if your stance is different? Dang, I never thought about that. So once we give them things to think about, once we give them tools and homework and extra credit to go home and do consistently, you'll start to see the change, especially if they're really working on it in a couple of weeks with getting them into a stance. And so that's what makes kind of what I do so fun, because I understand that a lot of things that I do and I implement can't be done really in a team structure. It's just not, especially right. In a year like this. If you got a rookie that has never been in the 3-point stance this year, and this year, he's screwed because those guys are reporting and they're going to ask them to get on board right now. Oh, yeah. And if they can't do it, they're going to get a veteran because they want to win ball games right now. So I think being able to work with these guys and to be able to start from the ground up with fundamentals and getting them to understand that the most important skill that they're going to have is to be able to replicate a functional stance from the ground up, be able to maintain that base, be able to set, reset, from the ground up, then that's half the battle. And then we start to teach and add in the Zuzus and the Wham Whams.
Well, yeah, it's like anything else. When we talk about the athletic position, everything starts from the stance. If you don't have a quality foundation, you have no chance to win the rep. So it makes a tremendous amount of success. And you brought up something else, just as a little tangent, about what you can do individually in the position you're in. And that's the uniqueness of the private sector. I keep wanting to reiterate that when I have the opportunities, because I've been in the private sector and I've been in the team facilities for most of my career. And one of the things that I want to continue to harp is those individuals, and you've been in both, those individuals who have never been in a team setting generally question what the team setting coaches, strength coaches usually do. Like, well, if I was there, I'd be doing this, this, and this. I promise you, there's a lot of things I would be doing if I had the ability to do it. The time restraint and the rules and regulations of what's allowed under NCAA rules, CBA collective bargaining agreements, at all affect the way we train. I know if you were doing a strength and conditioning job at a university level or a professional level, you're going to have to streamline everything we talk about today to fit within the constraints of what is allowed and what isn't allowed from a time constraints.
The program would be scaled down. It would be more general than specific. And what we would do is a lot like what you did is if there's some specifics, we would give them, and that's that OTS, extra credit type stuff that they would do on their own because there's just not enough time. I always laugh at, I'm very aware. I know that like if I was in a team setting, because I've been in a team setting, there's just a lot of stuff that you can't do because you don't have the time. One of the best things that ever happened for me was that early on at Humboldt State, I had to coach everything, and that was just how you rolled. You coached, women's volleyball, women and men's basketball, softball, track and field, football. But what it does is it gives you a great perspective on how different movement patterns look, your bang for your buck, different ailments that certain repeated motions are going to create with some of these players. And then you start to build out programs and best practices, no practices, your red light, green light, yellow light type system in which, hey, we're staying away from this. And so in a team setting, that's what you have to do. So I'm very fortunate that I am the captain of my own ship. And after I make my evaluations of specific guys, that I can put a specific plan. And there may be some days where I've got 3 guys that have the same sort of issues. I'm going to pair them together because we're going to work on those specific things that they need as we start to program our 3-week waves and things like that. And then once those things kind of get fixed, it could be a certain, as we prioritize, there could be a certain set of deficiencies that another 3 guys have that for that 3rd week block, they're going to work there. So again, that's not things you can do in a team setting, but things that I can do. So I'm very aware of that.
Yeah, I just sometimes, and again, maybe it's my age coming out, and I understand everybody has their opinion. I tell people all the time, I reserve the right to be wrong. I know what I know. It's like in the heart of hearts that I have a true passion on how I want to train someone, but I guess you could say it irritates me when you hear someone who's never been in that environment under those constraints saying how they would do it better than someone who has lived it. Because I can tell you it's much easier to go from the team setting to the private and develop a very cool training program than it is to go from private and never been in a team program and be like, yo, my man, you only got 2 hours. And believe me, these guys know how many hours they got.
Yeah, and you just spent an hour with prep.
Yeah, exactly.
Because
and you got to get done in 2 hours because they got 2 hours of meeting, and then they're out of the building.
Yep.
Time to go home.
And if you're lucky, you get a handful of guys that just love that process that will come back and go, OTS or specifics.
Yes. And again, and even then, you have to watch the rules because
CBA.
Yeah, the CBA says, hey, if they come in on their own, it's like safety. Yeah, it's like discretionary time.
Yep.
A little bit more about the stance, because there's one thing that I learned while I was in the NFL, even more so than in college, because I didn't hear about it as much. And we talk about, you've said it a little bit, we've all heard the term power position, or a position that gives you the benefit of absolute strength and power. And there's a little bit of a difference that I've learned, and you even brought it up when we were talking about some of the power position with an instep and heel stuff. But I learned this when we were teaching the squat when I first got to the NFL. And actually, Ryan Khalil we had a good discussion about this, about the power position coming in this day and age as stance versus the power position in a squat or a clean or a deadlift. And what I learned was, again, when I played and we got into a stance, and for most of the colleges, I started seeing it towards the end of the college career, you still had you were in a wide stance. Knees in line with the ankles, almost exactly like you squatted. Well, now as the game, to me, and again, always correct me after I'm done, Duke, because you know this way better than I do. You study way more tape and understand the game way better than I do. You are an expert in O-line. But as the game shifted from pure vertical pop to lateral displacement because of the way the defense has changed, now I learned that, and you said it, the instep, or the ability to have all the cleats in the ground, became very, very important to the power position of an offensive lineman. Now, in weight room terms, because that rotates the knee internally, that's a different power position, because for us, for the lack of a better term, we'll yell at a guy for his knees rotating in a squat.
Yeah.
But now what I had to learn and adapt to is, hey, I get it. These guys, the way the game's played, that is a power position because of the way they have to move when the ball is
mechanical advantage.
So tell me a little bit about that. And I always wondered, and you can tell me from your experience and with the amount of high quality O-linemen, does that type of instep, internally rotated knee positionings, how much do you see that stressing the MCL in linemen? Because we do see, it doesn't happen all the time, but you hear about a lot of MCL type strains with O-line play. Do you think that's a factor, or is it just part of being an O-lineman?
I think a little combination of the both, because you'll see there's some guys that are able to anatomically structure themselves in which that knee is slightly inside onto the instep, where they're not at risk. And then you see some guys that are so far internally rotated where it's almost like it hurts me to look at it. So again, that goes back to the function where a lot of those guys are so internally rotated, what that does to glute med and shutting off the glute med and the hamstring tension and things of that nature. So again, I truly believe that one size doesn't fit all in terms of the stance. There's no such thing as a cookie cutter stance for O-linemen. Whether 2-point or 3-point, you got to have a stance that is tailor made to each individual. That way they can own those power angles. That way, they can keep that tension in the hamstrings. That way, they're still protecting that knee from predisposed valgus, in which we kind of internally rotate in that. I truly believe that once we're starting to work on that stance, offensive line stance should definitely complement an offensive lineman's anatomical structure and ability to really own his skill set in terms of down in and down out. Too wide, you're not going to be able to cut off the backside. You just got no more surface area. You're not going to be able to use the ground to be able to drive through. And so you want to have the ability to be able to push the ground or push the turf away from you in either direction, whether you're talking about pushing the turf away from you through the right leg or the right instep to go left to cut off if I'm playing right guard, or to be able to reach. So I'm going to push the turf away from me going to my right to reach a player on my outside edge. It's the same thing of coming off the ball, tension in the hamstrings. That way you're not false stepping. If you're too wide, you're going to false step, getting off the ball, and then being able to drive off that front foot and be able to stick that back foot right back in the ground to take a pass set. So you're definitely correct. What we're starting to see now is when guys aren't coached up on it, it becomes a little too extreme, and that's where we're seeing a lot of the MCL injuries come from.
Yeah, and again, I get it and I understand it, and that's why, like I always talk about, like you were saying, you look at guys' dynamics when you're developing these programs, but I also felt why it was even more conducive to really analyze the old linemen when they squatted to alleviate that in positions where they don't have to do it. Like there's certain things that I think are trainable in the weight room, but then there's certain things that I'm thinking that I thought was, if they're getting this many reps in their position specific work,
let's take it out.
I don't want that replicated in the weight room. I don't want anything to look like. I want to actually do the opposite, like you said, because those types of positions activate some muscle groups more than others, but shut down other muscle groups. So it's better to train sometimes some opposite types of positioning to help build those muscle groups that are lacking. Because as you know, most great athletes are the best compensators.
Master compensators.
They know how to overcompensate, and it's our job to help try to even it. The one thing I've learned is don't get too crazy on correcting certain things because you may screw them all up. Like you were talking about.
Let them do what they do.
Stances. If you remember when Jordan Gross played for the Panthers, his pass set and his run, he had that hip opened up where that leg was literally, perpendicular to the line of scrimmage. But that's what he developed to be extremely successful for, a double-digit year NFL player, multiple-time Pro Bowler.
Arguably should be a Fringe Hall of Fame guy too.
Could be.
So.
Yeah, for sure.
Yep.
I mean, that guy, at that point in time, he started most games in the Panther history. So I was fortunate to coach him in college. Believe me, his stance wasn't like that in college. It evolved as he evolved as a player.
Yeah, I think, and if I'm not mistaken, Jeff Schwartz always talks about how Jordan Gross really took him under his wing and it helped him develop a functional stance, because at Oregon, Jeff was in the 2-point a lot. And so Jordan would grab him every day and work on his 3-point stance. And I think Jordan's stance ended up being developed and evolving from an ankle injury he had and then a broken leg, where he realized, like, shit, part of my athletic ability and mobility and stability was a little taken away. So now let's figure out how to get back to where I was in a different type stance. So I think that's really how Jordan, and it's kind of the same that you hear about Randall McDaniel. People talk about Randall McDaniel's stance when he was at, I think when he was at Arizona State, he kind of developed that going his senior year after he broke his leg or something, and it always stuck. It was his way to be able to get all his cleats in the ground and still be able to be functional within his stance. So absolutely, I think that you hit the nail on the head. There's some things you just got to let these guys do what they do. But then as coaches and as developers, there's some things that we have to protect these guys from, because they are master compensators. It is our job to first do no harm. I think you always say that. And, like my guy, Gray Cook, always says, move well, move often, but first you have to move well. And I think that's a lot of times the movement quality, movement literacy, and efficiency is something that kind of gets thrown out per se when, a lot of guys got this agenda of, I want him to lift X amount of weights, or a coach on the field, I want him to be able to do this. I want him to be able to do this. It's like, well, you're expecting him to do something that he ain't capable of doing right now. So let's find a way to fix that. But to your point with some of these things with the internal rotation, there's some things that, again, they do it so much, we're going to stay away from it. So like this year, I got away from, we do a lot of stance work, but in terms of like push-pull, like we say, you know what, we're going to go symmetrical, okay? We're going to go a symmetrical stance, and now you're going to have to learn how to engage, keep that tension in the hamstrings. They go, well, can I get into a right? Nope. Yeah. We're going to go push-pull drill with even feet.
Yeah, when them glutes start firing up.
Yeah. They're like, what is that? I'm like, yeah, you didn't know you did that. You're so darn quad dominant. Peterson step-ups, eccentric step-ups off the, some of those things that not only make some of those weaknesses, strengthen out, but it just brings things back into balance, and it's hitting in a different contraction in which they're used to. So those slanted Peterson step-ups have been great for O-line. Just a regular shin height box eccentric step up, or really is just an eccentric off a box. Doesn't even have to be loaded, but just making sure that those guys are locked in, still chest out over knee, slow load on the eccentric, and then not bouncing off that back foot, but just slightly touching, and then knowing that you can drive right back up starts to correct some of that stuff and starts to protect them from their own undoings, in which they're getting those repeated reps with that knee inside.
Yeah, I have that variation of that step. I call it touchdowns, because it doesn't have to be very much. 6-inch box, and just slow lower, get the heel,
light them up,
and just rep after rep after rep. It's funny with Jordan too. Jordan always used to tell me movement before muscle, but I also think he worked on that stance because he had to block Pep in practice for all those years.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
That wraps up part 2
excellent stuff.
of the OLine Mastermind series with Duke Manyweather. Part 3 will be coming up shortly. We're powered by Dynamic Fitness and Strength, building a better athlete. Please like and subscribe. And as always, see you next time, and words win.